Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess my first question would be if you could just talk a little bit about your job at UNESCO and Newcastle University and what you do related to cultural preservation.
Okay. Well, the first thing I must say is I don't work for UNESCO.
Oh,
So the UNESCO chair is or the UNESCO chair program is something that UNESCO do with universities around the world,
I
and
see.
there are about 650 or so UNESCO chairs in the world.
I see.
Um, all of which relate to the work of UNESCO in one way or another, so across science, education, and culture.
Mhm.
Um, but we don't work for UNESCO, and the best sort of description is that we are critical friends. As I say, we work with, but we don't speak for UNESCO. Um, so and the way that you get a UNESCO chair is that the university applies to UNESCO to create a UNESCO chair in an area that the university works in,
Mhm.
um, and wants some additional sort of contact with UNESCO. So I've been working in the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict since 2003 and a little bit beforehand. And in 2015, the university applied to UNESCO for a UNESCO chair in cultural property protection and peace. And we were granted that. It started on the 1st of January 2016, and we're now through the second 4-year period. UNESCO grant the chair status for a 4-year period. So we're almost exactly halfway through the second 4-year phase of that.
I see.
So that's the UNESCO chair, and the title of that in cultural property protection and peace is unique in the world. So I am the only UNESCO chair with that title.
Yeah.
What we do, and the university also pays for 1.5 other staff to work with me as that chair team. So we work with the military, other people of what we call the uniform sector, so border control, customs, police, other blue light services, and the humanitarian sector and the heritage sector. So we envisage Blue Shield, the UNESCO chair has a set of objectives, and one of the objectives is the creation of a strong and efficient organization of the Blue Shield. And the Blue Shield was envisaged by the people who wrote the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, but never created back in 1954. It was only created in 1996 in anticipation of the second protocol to the 54 convention. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the Second World War, the sort of international community realized that somebody else should get that in a minute, realized that the protection of people was indivisibly intertwined with the protection of their cultural property and their heritage, effectively, as it would be called today. So what we do is work with a whole range of people, as I say, in the military field, the heritage field, and the humanitarian field, to try and build that momentum of protecting people's heritage at the same time as protecting the people themselves.
I see. And like, what made you start all this? Like, what drew you to cultural preservation? I know that's a loaded question, but
well, I've been involved in archaeology and heritage management since the 1980s. And so I was involved in an organization called the World Archaeological Congress. And so the first time I got really involved with issues around the destruction of cultural property were in 1994, when this World Archaeological Congress, what we refer to as WAC, W-A-C, was supposed to be having an international conference in New Delhi in India in 1994. And that was 2 years after a Hindu mob had destroyed an Islamic mosque in the city of Ayodhya on the claim that underneath the mosque there was an earlier Hindu temple. And that was very controversial, and the impact on the conference was that we weren't allowed to talk about it. So we produced a small, we organized a smaller conference, which in fact took us 4 years to sort out, which I think happened in 1998. And that was on the destruction of cultural property. And a book came from that, which was the first bit of publication that I'd done with that. I co-edited that book. And so my interest had been sparked, but I was then in 2003 asked to be the archaeological advisor to the UK Ministry of Defence, as the Americans and the Brits were leading the invasion of Iraq in, as I say, early 2003. So that didn't go particularly well. The National Museum was looted, the National Archive was looted, the National Library was looted, libraries and archives across Iraq were looted, all of the regional museums were looted, and hundreds, if not thousands, of archaeological sites were looted. And a huge amount of that can be put down to the fact that those planning the invasion for the previous 8 or 9 months had failed to take on board the importance of cultural heritage and the importance of protecting it. And so I got involved at that stage and then decided that it was too important not to keep going with. And so I've been doing it ever since.
And I know you talked a little bit about your projects and your publications. I don't know if you really can answer this question, but do you have one that's really stood out to you, like one specific project that's just been really important to you that you've done, worked on?
I mean, there are loads. So I suppose, you know, it was the 1954 Hague Convention. And in 2003, neither the US nor the UK had ratified that convention. So getting or seeing American colleagues get the convention ratified, but not the 2 protocols in 2009 was great. But actually seeing the UK finally ratifying, or firstly passing an internal bill as an act that enabled us to ratify the whole of the 54 convention and both protocols in 2017 was a really good thing. In 2003, I wrote an article which prompted the British Army to start thinking about whether or not they should create a version of the old Second World War monuments men. And that unit became active in 2018. So that was another big plus. We've done lots of work and are doing more work with NATO. We are working, I mean, one of my colleagues, or 2 of my colleagues, have just come back from Georgia, training colleagues there. One of them was in Honduras earlier in the year, training people from a number of different South American countries. And the profile of Blue Shield has just grown fairly significantly in the last 5-8 years.
I'm sure I've seen that. And just you've been talking a lot about like the field work, and can you just go through like what that would look like? So let's say when you're on a project somewhere, like what would that look like? Maybe a few days, a few months, I don't know how long.
No, most of them are not much longer than a week or a couple of weeks. And most of them are either, we try to put all sort of classroom sessions into a practical context. So in a typical week of training, we might be in the classroom for 2.5 or 3 days, and then out on site, putting the ideas that people have been given in the classroom into practice on the ground, not in a real situation, but in a scenario that is as close to a real situation as we can give them. So, for example, the last one I was heavily involved in was at the end of February of this year, beginning of February this year, where we spent a week in Ireland at the UN peacekeeping school there, where we were training colleagues from about 5 or 6 European armed forces in the value of cultural property protection, specifically for UN peacekeepers. And we had 2 days of activity there, or day and a half of activity. So this was run at a military base about an hour's drive from Dublin. So we did half a day in the museum on site, and then a whole day in Dublin, where we worked on looking at a scenario that we'd sort of given the participants at the beginning of the week. They'd done some thinking about that in breakout groups as we went through the week, and then the day on the Thursday was when they went to actual sites and started looking at the implications of trying to protect those places if there was a problem going on in relation to the scenario that they've got.
I see.
And that's pretty similar all the way. When we're working with NATO, we work quite often on their big exercises, and that is where NATO start off with a plan to either defend somewhere or attack somewhere, and we then put into that process cultural property issues that they have to deal with in a legal way, and in a way that hopefully will work out the best for the cultural property and for their PR process and everything.
Yeah. So I know you've done obviously a lot about armed conflict. Has there also been some cultural preservation projects related to just generally, like not related to armed conflict, or has most of your work been focused on armed conflict?
So with the UNESCO chair and with the Blue Shield, nearly all of it is related to armed conflict or following natural or human-made disaster. Mm-hmm. So one of the other highlights was working following the explosion at the port in Beirut. And we'd been working in Lebanon since 2013, training the UN peacekeeping force, the Lebanese armed forces, the Department of Antiquities, and a few other relevant groups, with both the Blue Shield local organization, Blue Shield colleagues from Austria, and a local NGO called Biladi. And it took, with that 7 years of building partnership and building trust between the UN deployment, the Lebanese armed forces, the government and everybody, or the Department of Antiquities. We, in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the Department of Antiquities said, look, we can't cope. Can Blue Shield and Beladi help us by helping all of the private museums and libraries and archives that have been affected by the explosion? And so we did or colleagues in Lebanon, with our support, did a photographic survey, which essentially showed that none of the affected buildings had any doors or windows left, that some of them had lost bits of their roof, various ceilings had fallen, pipes had burst, those sorts of fairly small things. But we were able very quickly to get a grant to secure all of those places. But then the real positive of that was UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping deployment, were granted permission by the UN in New York to move out of their area of responsibility, which is very unusual. And they were allowed to go to Beirut to help. And so they phoned us up and said, there must be some cultural heritage that's been impacted by the explosion. How can we help? Now, that would never have happened had we not had 7 years worth of working together and building that partnership and trust. And what we were able to do with UNIFIL, sort of heavy lifting equipment and their structural engineers, the same colleagues from the Lebanese Armed Forces, in cooperation with the DGA and under the control of Blue Shield and Beladi architects, we were able to fully stabilize 2 buildings that were on verge of collapse. And those were 2 major historic buildings in Beirut, both of which were, as I say, on the verge of collapsing. But within that partnership, conserved them and stabilized them, and put temporary roofs and things on them and everything, so that they are now waiting for a lot of money to be found to do the full refurbishment of them. But our work is done by that initial securing and stabilizing work. It's up to the museum or an international museum organization or the heritage site or the government or whoever to find the money for the long-term refurbishment of places. So we go in that sort of situation as a quick emergency response, and that worked brilliantly.
So if these artifacts that you say weren't able to like find the money, right, to fix a museum, would those be going to like another museum somewhere, or what would happen to those like really important artifacts?
Well, I mean, again, that will depend from particular instance to particular instance. So as far as I know at the moment, but my focus on Beirut has been sidetracked by first a focus on Afghanistan, and then a focus on Ukraine, and then a focus on other countries in Eastern Europe, who might be feeling slightly more nervous than they were on the 23rd of February. So I'm a little out of date with what's going on in Beirut, but essentially, as far as I know, all of the private museums are looking for their own funding or to bring in funding from outside to stabilize their buildings properly, refurbish them properly, and open them again, because that's what they want to do. I don't think yet anybody has said we're going to give up now, and does anybody want our collection? But my presumption would be, if there was anybody in that situation, or that they couldn't bring in the money, then they would look for a source or another museum in Beirut, or certainly in Lebanon, to take their collection.
That makes sense. And you talked a little bit about the Ukraine, like your work in Ukraine. So Ukraine's obviously like a really big,
Mhm.
I'm guessing a really big spot for cultural preservation right now. Like, could you just
Yeah.
talk about what you've been doing there the past few months?
Well, I mean, the sadness with I mean, the biggest problem with what I do is that because few countries ever believe that they are going to go into an armed conflict, they don't prepare properly for an armed conflict. And so when there is an armed conflict, which happens as in Ukraine, fairly quickly, then it becomes as a shock to everybody, and there are um, they have a much bigger problem than had they actually done their planning and preparation work as they're supposed to do under the terms of the convention that they've ratified in peacetime. And so the Ukraine is a great example of people not really believing that there was going to be a problem.
Mhm.
And as a result, very little planning, with a couple of very notable exceptions, had been done. And therefore, they have got a much more difficult task than they would have had if they put the preparation in place. So we've been trying to help them with that sort of retrospective work. But actually, in terms of the heritage international community, the World and His Wife is trying to help Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah.
So while we are doing some specific things with colleagues there, our focus is actually on those 8 or 9 countries who are almost certainly in a similar situation to Ukraine, that they haven't prepared properly, but are now thinking perhaps they should. So, for example, I spent a week in a sort of a day of travel at each end, and then one day in Estonia, one in Latvia, and one in Lithuania, essentially just talking through with their ministries of defense, their ministries of culture, their major heritage organizations, what they've done, what they should be doing, and potentially how Blue Shield might be able to help.
So this planning and preparation work that you were talking about for these countries, could you talk a little bit about what it involves? Just because so my organization is based in Greece, right? And Greece is always like a hotspot with Turkey, always in the, and I'm not sure if they're really prepared. So what would you say is like the preparation work that a country would need?
Well, I mean, you need to think of all of the problems. I mean, increasingly museums have, if we just use museums, but as a shorthand for archives and libraries and other institutions, are increasingly getting better prepared for either natural disasters like flooding or bushfires in Australia, or whatever, or human-made like a fire or something like that. And so they're quite good at that. And so they know, or they have got an idea about what are their most important objects to get out of the building as quickly as possible. They should have a plan about where they're going to go to immediately, where they're and if where they're going to go, does that have the right environmental conditions? Can the material be, or the objects be packed, once the disaster has happened, or should they, if they can, plan to pack it beforehand? All of those sorts of things. Now, all of that is just multiplied by 10 in complexity when you're talking about an armed conflict.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, a simple one is you frequently have the National Library, the National Archive, and the National Museum in the capital city. Okay, so they all have, well, we hope they all have a disaster plan for a fire or for a flood. Okay, and usually that plan involves any of the material any of the collection they can get out of their museum or archive or library, going to the National Museum or the National Library if it's the National Archive that's had a fire. But in an armed conflict situation, that probably is no good, because the whole of the capital will be under threat, not just those three places. So they have to think, is there and using sort of technical language, is there a refuge in the country that material can be taken to safely? But taken to safely is a much more difficult process in an armed conflict than it would be if there had just been a fire at one of those places. So how do you do that? By moving, quite often multi-million pound or literally priceless collection from A to B, which may be over 100 miles, puts that collection at astonishing risk from all sorts of things. So they need to have planned that. They need to have planned the level of protection for that material. They need to have got the right packing materials for that, the right environmental conditions in the vehicles and the such. They need to have at the other end in the refuge the right packing materials, the right storage space, the right environmental conditions for a long stay, etc. But then if it's not going to be safe to leave it in the country, they have to think of where a safe haven in another country might be. And that has to be negotiated, a long time beforehand in peacetime, that we will, if there is a conflict in our country and we have to evacuate the collection of the National Museum, Library and Archive, you've said you're willing to take it, but we now have to sit down with our lawyers and work out exactly the legal process of how that will happen. And not infrequently, that this will have to be taken through another country to get to that country where it's aiming for, and then all of the legal ramifications of taking it across one or possibly even two borders. All of that needs to be put into place, and almost nobody's done it. So I'm not pointing a finger of blame at the Ukrainians. Everybody's in the same situation, because everybody has to do a prioritization of their resources, their staff time, their financial situation, and preparing for armed conflict frequently falls off the end of the budget line.
It's one of those things you just don't expect as a country, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so as we talked about, my organization is like mostly focused in Greece and around the Cycladic Islands. I was wondering, I think I read that you did work a little bit in Greece. Am I correct in saying?
I did, but I mean, not in this area. I worked in Greece for a year back in 1980 or 79, 80 as a teacher.
Oh, okay.
So not in this, although I spent a lot of time in the archaeological libraries and seeing the archaeological sites, but it was on the back of a different job. Although I've been back to Greece a number of times over the last, 5 or 10 years, talking about this work.
I see. And just because Greece is a country with, as you obviously know, a lot of statues and like built-in things. So how would the process be different for like something that's built in, like a statue, or like the Acropolis is the biggest example, of course, but like just things that are built in that you can't just move?
I mean, that becomes more difficult. There are, there are ways of sandbagging things. There are ways of putting, shelters over a building. But all of that takes a lot of time and is extremely expensive, and may not be, even if you sandbagged and put in other measures, for the whole of the Parthenon, a direct hit from a large weapon would destroy it. So, one of the other things you can do, and the examples of this from the Second World War, is declare that city as a city that there will not be any military occupation of or fighting over. So they did that for Venice, for example, in the Second World War. So you could potentially anticipate or expect that people might do that for Athens. But that would have to be put in place, you know, at the beginning at least of a conflict, if not long before. And but then that leads to, you know, you and I sit smugly in two countries that don't anticipate being invaded very soon. But there are clear examples of the terrorist threat in both of our countries being far higher than they are in many countries that might actually be invaded. And cultural sites are high on the target list for some terrorist organizations. So, you know, while terror isn't actually part of, well, it's not normally defined as part of armed conflict, we certainly take it as part of armed conflict, and would try to work with a museum or any other site to mitigate the possibility of an attack, and put in, you know, appropriate security measures to try and protect it.
I see. And because Greece, I'm not sure, but I think that Greece wouldn't be one of the countries that's most well prepared, considering the situation economically, politically, just the chaos going on there. And as much as I love my country, I have to admit they're not the most organized in this type of stuff. So just for the average person, right? Because especially the Cycladic Islands where I live, there's so much I'm from, there's so much history there that, like, I think a person wouldn't even know, right? Like in Paros, where I'm from, there's just, people think of the one big church, but even under the church, there's statues from like before Christ. So there's a lot of really ancient things that people don't know about. So what could like the average person or the church just do to help in a day-to-day situation, right? Not in an armed conflict, just because these aren't being taken care of. They're in the sun, they're in the heat, they're in fires. There's a lot of forest fires, the salt water. So what would you say? Like
you know, it's, I mean, that takes it out of the sort of area that the Blue Shield or the UNESCO chair work in, because we focus on the most extreme issues. But, you know, I worked for 10 years for English Heritage, and that's the state organization in the UK that had, well, when I worked for it, had the responsibility of looking after all of the heritage sites, so the old castles and abbeys and things like that, all ruined, in control of the government, not the private ones, but also that we had a finger in the control of some of the private, or all of the private ones as well. So, you know, we would just encourage people to, you know, have a membership program for, you know, local sites, have volunteers for the local sites, have the protection of property as part of the school curriculum, have, you know, scouts and guides and others have protection of heritage as part of their work. There are all sorts of ways of doing it. I used to work in Southern Africa quite a lot, and there was one particular site in Zimbabwe where it was being vandalized and looted, and the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, you know, couldn't keep staff there on a regular basis. Even when they had staff there, the staff couldn't stop all of that going on. And so there were all sorts of problems. They eventually put a big fence around the whole site. And of course, the fence was stolen. And then we sort of hit upon the idea of the local school adopting the site. And so the kids used to go if not every week, every couple of weeks, to the site and do some of their schoolwork in relation to the site. So if they were doing maths, they would measure between parts of the, parts of the site. They would work out how high that bit of the site was. If they were doing, creative writing, they would go to the site and think about words that they could use in their creative writing. So that they tried to do that, but they also went on a regular basis and cleaned up the site, and they started telling their parents about the site and the fact that nobody should be looting the site and taking objects to build houses with or anything like that. So over a couple of year period, the amount of damage being done to the site dropped significantly because it had been adopted by the headmaster and then by all of the kids. So there are ways of doing things, and I could see that happening in Paros as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. Well, I mean, thank you so much. You answered all of my questions very, very well, very thoroughly. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And I hope that one day you can come and see Paros for itself. I don't know if you've already been. It's a very nice island.
It is. It's lovely. Yeah.
And I was wondering, I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot here, but if you have any other recommendations for who I could interview. I've been looking around for a lot of people, and I've gotten, and most people aren't really like this culture. The topic of cultural preservation isn't such a. It's difficult to find people in, I think. So if you have any recommendations, please let me know.
Okay. I mean, there is and if you Google it, you can probably find it. There is a Blue Shield National Committee in Greece.
Okay.
I'm sure somebody there would talk to you about the sorts of things that they're trying to do.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, so tell me a little bit about your organization.
Yeah. So I started a few months ago. I decided I wanted to really help my country. I've been seeing all these things about, so I'll start with my history, really. My mom is Greek and my dad is also Greek, but he was born in the United States to Greek parents. And we lived in Greece for the first 7-8 years of my life. And then I moved to China, then I moved to Germany, and then I moved to New Jersey where I live now. And I go to Greece every year for at least 2 to 3 months over the summer, over the winter, whenever I can. And I've just been seeing that lately. No, it's not specifically related to the Turkey issue, but it's been so it's dying. Like there's forest fires every year. The monuments are just dying, and it's something that's really been important to me. It's like who I am. It's always like the landmarks that I see there are who I am. Like I see them every year, and it's a shame going to pieces. So I've really wanted to do something to help. So I decided to start the Cycladic Preservation Group, and the main focus would be interviewing people like you to inform the community, but also then doing hands-on projects over the summer. I'm hoping this summer that I'll be able to do that. Okay.
So how's your Greek? Are you fluent in Greek?
Yeah, I'm fluent. I speak Greek with my parents most of the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Or Ndaxi. Then if you're like that, I would try and talk to I think she calls herself the president of the Greek National Committee, who's Elena Korka, and she would be a great person to talk to.
And I've also been in touch with I don't know if you know this, it's the Benaki Museum.
I know the Benaki, yeah.
Yeah, I've been in touch there, maybe just to look around, just to see to see a little bit about the museum, maybe a few interviews there, and just be there for a bit. So
yeah, okay. That's the Benaki in Athens.
Yes, in Athens.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, very best of luck with it.
Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great year, a great day.
And you. Take care. Bye-bye.